The gunshot echoed through the dusty street of Seligman, Arizona, causing Beatrice Clarke to flinch as she scrubbed the worn wooden floorboards of the general store. It wasn't the sound that startled her. Gunfire had become as common as birdsong in their small frontier town, but the knowledge that her husband Frank was likely in the saloon again, drinking away the money meant for their children's winter clothes. The year was 1881, and life in the Arizona Territory was unforgiving enough without a husband who preferred whiskey to responsibility. Beatrice wrung her cloth into the bucket of soapy water, watching the dirt dissolve into murky swirls. At 32, she felt twice her age, worn down by the constant struggle of raising 6 children with diminishing resources. "Miss Beatrice, I think we're finished for the day." Mr. Holloway, the store owner, approached with her wages $3 for a full day's work. "Not nearly enough, but better than nothing." "Thank you, sir." She tucked the money into the small pocket sewn inside her faded blue dress. $3 that Frank must never discover. $3 closer to her desperate plan to save her family. Outside, the September heat still clung to the air despite the approaching evening. Beatrice gathered her shawl and hurried past the saloon, careful not to look inside. The Last Chance Saloon had become Frank's second home over the past 2 years, ever since the mine accident that had left him with a pronounced limp and a deepening affection for whiskey. The Clarke family lived in a small, weathered cabin on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much 2 rooms for 8 people, but Beatrice had managed to make it feel like home with carefully mended curtains and wildflowers in tin cans. As she approached, she heard her children's voices, and her heart lightened despite her exhaustion. "Mama's home." 6-year-old Lucy spotted her first, her blonde curls bouncing as she ran to meet Beatrice. One by one, the children appeared. 12-year-old Thomas, serious and already shouldering responsibilities beyond his years. 10-year-old Sarah with her quiet intelligence. 8-year-old twins James and William, inseparable troublemakers, and finally little Lucy, clinging to her mother's skirts. Only Emma, their eldest at 14, remained inside, likely tending to the stew Beatrice had started that morning. "Have you all been good for your sister?" Beatrice asked, embracing each child in turn. "Yes, Mama," they chorused, though the twins exchanged a glance that suggested otherwise. Inside, Emma stood over the cook stove, her dark hair so like Frank's pulled back in a practical braid. "Pa hasn't been home," she said without preamble. Beatrice nodded, both relieved and worried. "The stew smells wonderful, Emma. You've done well." The family ate their meager dinner around the worn table, the children sharing stories from their day. Thomas had helped the blacksmith and earned a penny, which he proudly presented to his mother. Sarah had found a bird's nest with 3 blue eggs. The twins had caught a toad but admitted to letting it go after Emma insisted. Lucy had practiced her letters. These simple joys sustained Beatrice, even as she set aside a portion of stew for Frank that would likely go cold and uneaten. It was past midnight when the door crashed open, startling Beatrice from her light sleep on the straw mattress she shared with her 3 daughters. Frank stumbled in, reeking of whiskey and tobacco, his once handsome face now perpetually flushed and bloated. "Woman," he slurred, "where's my dinner?" "On the stove, Frank," Beatrice answered quietly, not wanting to wake the children. He lurched toward the cookstove, knocking over one of the chairs. "Cold," he complained, slamming the bowl down. "Always cold. If you came home at dinner time, don't you dare lecture me." Frank's voice rose dangerously. "I work hard for this family," the bitter laugh escaped before Beatrice could stop it. "When was the last time you brought home a penny, Frank? The children need shoes for winter." Lucy's coughing again. Frank's face darkened. "You calling me worthless?" "I'm calling you a drunk," Beatrice said, finding courage in her desperation. "And I'm asking you to stop, for the children, for us." For a moment, something like shame flickered across Frank's face, but it quickly hardened into anger. "Where's the money from today? I know Holloway pays you." "I spent it on food," Beatrice lied, thinking of the $3 hidden in the loose floorboard beneath their bed. Frank advanced toward her, his limp more pronounced in his intoxicated state. "You're lying to me. Your own husband." Emma stirred on the mattress, sitting up with wide, fearful eyes. "Pa, please," she whispered. Frank turned his glare to their eldest daughter. "You stay out of this, girl." "Leave her be, Frank," Beatrice stepped between them. "The children need sleep." "We can talk about this tomorrow when you're sober." "I need money now," he insisted. "Owe some to Mac at the saloon. He's not a patient man." Beatrice felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "You've been gambling again." Frank's silence confirmed her fears. The money she had painfully saved over months, nearly $30 hidden beneath the floorboard, was their only hope for the winter ahead. If Frank discovered it, it would be gone in days, lost to cards and whiskey. "Get some sleep," she said finally. "There's no money tonight." For a tense moment, she thought he might strike her, as he had done twice before when deep in his cups. But instead, he cursed and stumbled toward their small bedroom where the boys were sleeping. "Thomas, James, William," he barked. "Get out here. Sleep with your mother and sisters tonight." The boys emerged, bleary-eyed and confused, as Frank collapsed onto their bed without removing his boots. Within minutes, his snores filled the cabin. Beatrice arranged her sons as comfortably as possible on the floor with spare blankets. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though only Thomas was still awake enough to hear. "It's all right, Ma," he replied with a maturity that broke her heart. "One day I'll make enough money so you won't have to worry anymore." She kissed his forehead, fighting back tears. "Sleep now. Tomorrow will be better." But as she lay awake, listening to her children's breathing and Frank's rumbling snores, Beatrice knew tomorrow would bring only more of the same unless something changed. The money beneath the floorboard wouldn't last forever, and winter in Arizona territory was unforgiving to families without proper provisions. As dawn broke over Seligman, Beatrice was already up, stoking the fire and preparing cornmeal mush for breakfast. Frank emerged from the bedroom, haggard and irritable with his hangover. "Coffee," he grunted, avoiding her eyes. "We've been out for 3 days," she replied, keeping her voice neutral for the children's sake. Frank sat heavily at the table, wincing at the light streaming through the windows. The children ate quietly, casting nervous glances at their father. "I'll be heading to the Silver Strike today," Frank announced suddenly. "They're hiring again." Hope flickered briefly in Beatrice's chest. The Silver Strike mine had been Frank's employer before the accident, before the drinking took hold. "That's wonderful news," she said cautiously. "Need $2 for new boots," he added, extending his hand expectantly. And just like that, the hope withered. "I don't have $2, Frank." His eyes narrowed. "Holloway pays you $3 for cleaning." "Which goes to feeding your children," she countered, gesturing to the meager breakfast before them. Frank's fist came down hard on the table, making the bowls jump. Lucy began to cry softly, and Emma quickly pulled her sister onto her lap. "I need those boots to work," Frank shouted. "You want me to provide, don't you? Or do you prefer me useless?" Beatrice closed her eyes briefly, calculating. If she gave him 2 of her hidden dollars, there was a chance, however small, that he might actually seek work. If she refused, today would spiral into arguments and threats, with Frank eventually stomping off to the saloon anyway. "I have some saved," she said at last. "But Frank, I'm begging you use it for boots, not whiskey." The children watched in tense silence as Beatrice retrieved $2 from her hiding place. Frank snatched the money, a flicker of guilt crossing his features before he hardened again. "I'll be home with more," he promised, not meeting her eyes. Then he was gone, the door slamming behind him. Beatrice sighed, turning to her children with forced cheerfulness. "Thomas, Sarah off to school. Emma, can you watch the little ones while I go to the Holloways?" As the family dispersed to their daily tasks, Beatrice fought down her despair. She had exactly $28 hidden away now, not nearly enough to see them through winter, let alone offer any hope of a different future. At the general store, Mrs. Holloway greeted her with concern. "Beatrice, you look exhausted. Is everything all right?" Beatrice managed a smile. "Just a long night, Martha. Children with nightmares, you know how it is." Martha Holloway, whose 4 children were grown and scattered across the territory, nodded sympathetically. "I've set aside some cloth remnants for you. Thought you might make something for little Lucy." Gratitude warmed Beatrice as she accepted the bundle. "That's very kind. Lucy's growing so fast." As she cleaned, Beatrice considered her options. She could confront Frank, demand he stop drinking, but those conversations had never ended well. She could take the children and leave, but to where? With what money? The nearest town was 40 miles away, and she had no family left to turn to. Lost in these circular thoughts, she barely noticed when the store's bell jingled, announcing a customer. It was only when a deep voice requested ammunition that she looked up and saw him. He was tall, his frame filling the doorway, a stranger in a town where everyone knew everyone. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality. A dark blue shirt, black vest, denim pants tucked into well-made boots. A silver star glinted on his chest, identifying him as a lawman of some kind. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with keen gray eyes that noticed everything, including her staring. "Madam," he acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat before turning back to Mr. Holloway. "Sheriff Adams is passing through on his way to Prescott," Mr. Holloway explained to Beatrice. "Tracking some troublemakers who have been hitting the smaller settlements." The sheriff, Daniel Adams, as she would later learn, finished his business quickly, purchasing ammunition, coffee, and hardtack. As he paid, he glanced again at Beatrice, a flicker of something like concern crossing his features before he nodded politely and departed. "Handsome fellow," Mrs. Holloway remarked when he was gone, "and a widower, from what he mentioned." "Martha," her husband chided gently. "Don't go matchmaking." "I'm just making conversation," Mrs. Holloway protested, but she winked at Beatrice, who felt herself blush for the first time in years. "He'll be gone by morning anyway," Beatrice said, returning to her scrubbing. "Men like that don't stay in places like Seligman." But as she worked through the afternoon, Beatrice found herself thinking of the sheriff's steady gaze, so different from Frank's perpetually bloodshot eyes. It wasn't attraction she felt, she was a married woman. After all, but something like envy for a life where men like Daniel Adams existed. Men who carried themselves with quiet dignity, who met their responsibilities without resentment. By the time she finished at the store, the sun was setting, painting Seligman's dusty Main Street in gold and amber. Beatrice hurried home, her payment for the day secure in her pocket, hoping against hope that Frank had actually gone to the mine as promised. Her heart sank as she passed the Last Chance saloon and heard Frank's distinctive laugh from within. Through the grimy window, she could see him at a table, cards in one hand, whiskey in the other. The boots he had claimed to need were nowhere in sight. Anger and despair warred within her as she continued home. The $2 money that could have bought flour and beans for a week were likely already lost. The cabin was quiet when she arrived. Emma had fed the younger children and put them to bed early, exhausted from a day of play in the late summer heat. "Did Pa come home?" Beatrice asked, though she already knew the answer. Emma shook her head. Not since this morning. She hesitated, then added, Ma, Mr. Peterson from the general store came by. He said Pa owes him $5 for last month's credit, and he can't extend any more until it's paid. Beatrice sank into a chair, the weight of their situation crushing down on her. Peterson's store was their lifeline for flour, sugar, and other staples they couldn't produce themselves. Without credit there, they would have to rely solely on what Beatrice could earn day to day. We'll manage, she assured Emma, reaching out to squeeze her daughter's hand. I'll speak with Mr. Peterson tomorrow. Emma looked doubtful but nodded. I saved you some stew. It's mostly vegetables, but it's warm. After Emma went to bed, Beatrice sat alone by the dying fire, allowing herself the rare luxury of tears. She had endured so much: the death of her parents, the harsh frontier life, Frank's transformation from the charming, hard-working man she had married to the bitter drunk he had become. But it was the suffering of her children that broke her heart. They deserved so much more than a father who drank away their security and a mother too worn down to provide it herself. The door creaked open just after midnight. Frank staggered in, stumbling against the table. "Where have you been?" Beatrice asked quietly, though she didn't need the answer. "Celebrating," Frank slurred, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "Celebrating what, exactly? Losing the money for your boots." Frank's face darkened. "Don't start, woman. I'm not in the mood. And I'm not in the mood to watch my children go hungry because their father would rather drink than work." Beatrice shot back, too exhausted for caution. Frank lunged forward suddenly, grabbing her arm with bruising force. "You think you're better than me? You with your holier-than-thou attitude." "Let go," Beatrice hissed, aware of the children sleeping just feet away. "You're hurting me." "I could hurt you a lot worse," Frank threatened, his grip tightening. "Maybe that would teach you some respect." "The only lesson here is for our children," Beatrice replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Watching their father turn into a monster." Something in her words penetrated Frank's alcohol-fogged mind. He released her arm, stepping back as if burned. For a moment, she glimpsed the man she had married, confused, ashamed, lost. "I tried at the mine today," he said, his voice breaking. "They wouldn't take me back, said I was unreliable." Beatrice rubbed her bruised arm, unmoved by his self-pity. "And instead of coming home to tell me, you went to the saloon." "What was I supposed to do?" Frank demanded, his momentary vulnerability hardening again. "Come home and admit I'm worthless, that I can't provide for my own family?" "Yes," Beatrice said simply. "That's exactly what a real man would do, face his failures and find another way forward." Frank's face twisted with rage. "You don't know what it's like. The pain in my leg never stops. The whiskey helps." "And what about their pain?" Beatrice gestured toward their sleeping children. "Does whiskey help that too?" Frank had no answer. He turned away, stumbling toward their bedroom. "I'm going to sleep. Leave me be." Beatrice remained by the fire until it burned down to embers, turning her options over and over in her mind. By dawn, she had made a decision. She would use the money hidden beneath the floorboard to secure a future for her children, with or without Frank's cooperation. She just needed to find the right opportunity. That opportunity arrived sooner than expected, in the form of Sheriff Daniel Adams. The next morning, as Beatrice was hanging laundry behind the cabin, she heard the steady clop of hooves approaching. Shielding her eyes against the morning sun, she was surprised to see the sheriff riding slowly toward their home. He dismounted with easy grace, removing his hat as he approached. "Mrs. Clarke, I'm Sheriff Adams from the Yavapai County office." "I remember you from the store yesterday," Beatrice replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" His gray eyes were direct but kind. I'm afraid there was an incident at the Last Chance Saloon last night. Your husband was involved. Beatrice's heart sank. Is he hurt? No, madam, but he's being held in the town jail. He assaulted another patron over a card game. The man suffered a broken nose. I see. Beatrice wasn't entirely surprised, but shame burned through her nonetheless. What happens now? He'll face the circuit judge when he comes through next week. In the meantime, he needs to post $5 bail if he wants to be released before the hearing. $5. Nearly a week's wages at the store, money that would have to come from her hidden savings. Sheriff Adams seemed to read her thoughts. If you're unable to post bail, madam, he'll remain in custody until the judge arrives. Beatrice hesitated, an unexpected thought crossing her mind. If Frank remained in jail, he couldn't drink away their money. He couldn't threaten her in the night. For 1 week, the children would be safe from his unpredictable moods. I'll need time to consider, she said finally. We don't have much to spare. The sheriff nodded, understanding in his eyes. The decision is yours, Mrs. Clarke. Though I should mention your husband asked me to tell you he's sorry. Said it was the whiskey talking. Beatrice had heard those apologies before, always followed by promises to change that lasted mere days, sometimes only hours. Thank you for coming all the way out here to tell me, Sheriff, she said, avoiding a direct response. Sheriff Adams replaced his hat. I'll be in town for a few more days, looking into some other matters. If you decide to post bail, you can find me at the marshal's office. As he turned to leave, Beatrice found herself asking, Sheriff Adams, may I ask why you're delivering this message personally? Surely Seligman has its own law enforcement. He paused, considering his words carefully. Your husband mentioned he has 6 children at home. I wanted to make sure they were being looked after, given the circumstances. The simple kindness of his concern brought unexpected tears to Beatrice's eyes. She blinked them back quickly. We're managing, Sheriff. We always do. He studied her for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on the fading bruise on her arm where Frank had grabbed her the night before. If you need assistance, Mrs. Clarke, don't hesitate to ask. The town has resources for families in difficult situations. After the sheriff departed, Beatrice sat on the cabin's back step, weighing her options. $5 would secure Frank's release, but to what end? He would return home, contrite for a day or two, then fall back into his old patterns. Or she could leave him in jail for the week, giving herself and the children a brief respite. By midday, she had made her decision. She would not post bail. Instead, she would use the week to prepare for a confrontation that was long overdue. Telling the children proved harder than she'd anticipated. The younger ones accepted that their father was helping the sheriff with important business, but Thomas and Emma, old enough to understand the realities of jail, looked at her with a mixture of relief and worry. Is Pa in trouble? Thomas asked that night as they washed dishes together. Yes, Beatrice answered honestly, but not the kind that can't be fixed. He made a bad choice when he was drinking, and now he has to face the consequences. Thomas nodded solemnly. Is that why you didn't get him out? Because he needs to learn. Beatrice's hands stilled in the dishwater. Partly, and partly because we need the money for other things. Winter is coming. I understand, Ma, Thomas said, sounding far older than his 12 years. And I think you did the right thing. The days that followed were strangely peaceful. Without Frank's volatile presence, the cabin felt lighter somehow. The children laughed more freely. Beatrice slept through the night without tensing at every sound. She worked at the general store and took on extra laundry for the hotel, adding to her hidden savings. On the 4th day after Frank's arrest, Beatrice encountered Sheriff Adams again at the general store. He was purchasing supplies for his continued stay in Seligman, and they exchanged polite greetings. "Your husband has been sober for 4 days now," the sheriff mentioned as they both waited for Mr. Holloway to wrap their purchases. "Probably the longest stretch in quite some time, from what I gather." Beatrice nodded, unsurprised that the sheriff had deduced Frank's drinking problem. "Forced sobriety isn't the same as choosing it, Sheriff." "No, it isn't," he agreed. "But sometimes a man needs to be clear-headed before he can see the damage he's causing." There was something in his tone that caught Beatrice's attention. "You sound like you speak from experience." A shadow passed over the sheriff's face. "My father was similar to your husband. Good man when sober, but the drink turned him mean. My mother endured it until consumption took her. After that, it was just me and my younger sister facing his rages." "I'm sorry," Beatrice said softly. "What happened? I left home at 16, became a lawman at 20. By the time I had established myself and returned for my sister, my father had drunk himself to death." His gray eyes met hers directly. "I've seen what whiskey does to families, Mrs. Clarke. It's why I took an interest in your situation." Before Beatrice could respond, Mr. Holloway returned with their packages. Sheriff Adams tipped his hat and departed, leaving Beatrice with much to consider. That night, as her children slept, Beatrice made a final decision. When Frank faced the judge, she would be there. And regardless of the outcome, she would present him with an ultimatum: sobriety and responsibility, or he would have to leave. She could no longer sacrifice her children's well-being for a man who refused to help himself. The circuit judge arrived in Seligman on a dusty Thursday afternoon, hearing cases in the town's small courthouse. Frank's case was among the last called. Beatrice sat in the back, her best dress pressed for the occasion, as Frank was led in by the local deputy. She barely recognized her husband. 4 days without whiskey had hollowed his cheeks and cleared his complexion. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were clearer than she had seen in months. When he spotted her in the courtroom, surprise and something like shame crossed his features. The charges were read: drunk and disorderly conduct, assault over a gambling dispute. Frank pleaded guilty, his voice steady as he admitted his wrongs. "Mr. Clarke," the judge said severely, "this court takes a dim view of men who solve their disputes with fists rather than words. However, as the injured party has declined to press further charges, and this appears to be your first offense in this jurisdiction, I sentence you to a fine of $20 or 15 days in the county jail." $20. Nearly all of Beatrice's carefully hoarded savings. She closed her eyes briefly, steeling herself for what must come next. As the court adjourned, Sheriff Adams approached her. "Mrs. Clarke, may I have a word?" She followed him to a quiet corner of the courthouse. "What is it, Sheriff?" "Your husband will be transported to the county jail tomorrow unless the fine is paid," he explained. "I wanted to make sure you understood your options." "I understand," Beatrice replied. "But before I decide whether to pay the fine, I need to speak with my husband. Is that possible?" Sheriff Adams nodded. "I can arrange 15 minutes in the holding cell. Follow me." Frank looked up as they approached the cell, rising quickly to his feet. He appeared simultaneously relieved and apprehensive at the sight of his wife. "Beatrice," he began. 15 minutes," Sheriff Adams interrupted, unlocking the cell door to admit Beatrice. "I'll be just outside if you need me, madam." When they were alone, Frank reached for her hands. Beatrice stepped back, maintaining distance between them. "How are the children?" he asked awkwardly. "They're well," she answered. "Better than they've been in some time, actually. Peaceful." Frank winced at the implication. "I'm sorry, I know I've been difficult." "Difficult," Beatrice repeated. "Frank, you've been destroying our family. The drinking, the gambling, the rages. The children walk on eggshells around you. I lie awake at night wondering if this is the time you'll follow through on your threats." Frank's face crumpled. "I would never hurt you, Bea, not really." She pulled up her sleeve, revealing the yellowing bruise. "You already have. And the worst damage isn't physical. It's watching the man I love disappear into a bottle, watching our children learn to fear their own father." Frank sank onto the cell's narrow cot, his head in his hands. "I don't know how to stop," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I've tried, but the pain in my leg, the shame of not providing the whiskey makes it bearable." "And what about our pain?" Beatrice asked, echoing her words from their last confrontation. "I have $23 left from what I've managed to save." "I can pay your fine, Frank, but not without conditions." He looked up, wary. "What conditions?" "You stop drinking, completely. You find work, any work, even if it's not at the mine. You become the husband and father this family deserves." She took a deep breath. "Or you leave. Take the $20 and start fresh somewhere else, but don't come back until you're sober." Frank stared at her, shock evident in his features. "You'd send me away?" "After 12 years of marriage, I would," Beatrice confirmed, surprising herself with her resolve. "Because I love our children more than I fear being alone. They deserve better than what you've become." "And if I promise to change?" Frank asked quietly. "Would you believe me?" Beatrice considered the question seriously. "I want to," she admitted, "but promises made in a jail cell are easy. Living them day after day is harder." Frank nodded slowly. What if I had help?" Before Beatrice could ask what he meant, Sheriff Adams returned, signaling their time was up. As she turned to leave, Frank called after her. "Bea, wait, I need more time to think. Don't pay the fine yet." Surprised, she paused. "You'd rather stay in jail?" "Maybe it's where I belong right now," Frank said, a hint of his old determination in his voice. "Give me the 15 days. I'll be sober when I come out, and then we can talk about the future." Beatrice studied him for a long moment, searching for signs of manipulation or deceit. Finding none, she nodded. 15 days. We'll be waiting when you're released." As she left the jail, Sheriff Adams fell into step beside her. "That can't have been an easy conversation, Mrs. Clarke." "No," she agreed, "but necessary. He's choosing to serve the time rather than have me pay the fine." The sheriff looked thoughtful. "That's a start, a small one, but still." "What did he mean about having help?" Beatrice asked suddenly. "Did you speak with him about his drinking?" Sheriff Adams hesitated before answering. "We've had some conversations during his time here. I shared my experiences with my father, offered some perspective. I also mentioned there's a temperance group in Prescott, men helping other men stay away from liquor. I said I'd be willing to introduce him if he was serious about changing." Gratitude washed over Beatrice. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" The sheriff's gaze was steady. "Because I've seen what drink does to good men and what it does to the families who love them. And because no one offered my father that kind of help when he needed it." For the first time in years, Beatrice felt a flutter of hope. Not that Frank would magically transform, but that perhaps he truly wanted to try. With the right support, maybe he could become the man she had married again. "Thank you, Sheriff Adams," she said sincerely. "Your kindness won't be forgotten." He tipped his hat. "Daniel, please, and it's no more than anyone deserves." The 15 days of Frank's sentence stretched into an oddly productive time for the Clarke family. Beatrice continued working at the general store, and with Sheriff Adams's discreet assistance, she secured additional work sewing shirts for the miners. Thomas found steady employment helping the blacksmith, bringing home a few pennies each day. Even Emma contributed by watching the younger children of a new mother in town. Sheriff Adams became a regular visitor to their cabin, initially checking that they had enough to eat, then gradually staying for meals or to help Thomas with repairs to their leaking roof. He taught James and William to whittle, and showed Sarah how to identify animal tracks. He brought Lucy a small wooden horse he had carved himself, earning her instant adoration. With each visit, Beatrice found herself increasingly drawn to the sheriff's quiet strength and genuine kindness. It wasn't romance, she felt she was still a married woman, after all, but a growing appreciation for what a good man truly looked like. "Why have you stayed in Seligman so long?" she asked him one evening as they sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset while the children played in the yard. "Surely your duties take you elsewhere." Daniel leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "Initially, I was tracking those troublemakers I mentioned. They've since been apprehended near Prescott. And after that," Beatrice pressed gently, his gray eyes met hers. "I suppose I found reasons to stay, people who needed help." The implication hung in the air between them, unacknowledged but understood. Daniel Adams had remained in Seligman because of them, because of her. "Frank will be released tomorrow," Beatrice said finally. "He may choose to leave rather than face the challenge of sobriety." Daniel nodded. "And if he stays, if he's willing to try, then I'll support his efforts," she replied honestly. "He's still my husband, still their father. I made vows." "You're a remarkable woman, Beatrice Clarke," Daniel said softly. "Your husband is fortunate, whether he realizes it or not." The morning of Frank's release dawned clear and cool. October had brought the first hints of autumn to Seligman, and Beatrice dressed carefully in her blue dress, Frank's favorite, Once Upon a Time. She walked alone to the jail, having decided the children should wait at home for whatever news she might bring. Frank emerged from the cell looking like a different man. 15 days without alcohol had steadied his hands and cleared his complexion. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair. Most striking were his eyes, clear and focused, without the bloodshot haze that had become so familiar. "Beatrice," he said simply, drinking in the sight of her. "Frank," she replied, studying this version of her husband with cautious hope. "You look well." He stepped forward hesitantly. "I'm sober. 15 days now. The shakes were bad at first, but Sheriff Adams helped me through it." Beatrice glanced at Daniel, who stood discreetly nearby. "He mentioned a group in Prescott that might help you stay that way." Frank nodded. "The sheriff's arranged for me to meet them. There's a wagon heading that way tomorrow." He paused, uncertainty crossing his features. "But I need to know if I have a home to come back to afterward." The question hung between them, weighted with 12 years of marriage, 6 children, countless broken promises, and this one fragile new beginning. "That depends," Beatrice said carefully. "Are you choosing sobriety because you want it, or because you fear losing your family?" "Both," Frank admitted. "I want to be the man you married again, the father our children deserve. I don't know if I can do it alone." "You won't be alone if you choose to try," Beatrice promised. "But this is your last chance, Frank. I won't subject the children to more broken promises." Frank took her hands in his grip gentle but sure. "I understand, and I accept your terms." He glanced over at Sheriff Adams. "The sheriff has offered to accompany me to Prescott, introduce me to the temperance group. I'll be gone about 2 weeks." Beatrice looked between the two men, sensing an understanding had been reached between them during Frank's confinement. 2 weeks, she repeated. "And then?" "And then I come home and prove myself day by day," Frank said simply. "If you'll have me." Beatrice studied her husband's face, searching for sincerity. Finding it, she nodded. "The children will want to see you before you go." As they walked home together, Frank limping but purposeful, Beatrice felt a tentative hope unfurling within her. Not certainty, she was too pragmatic for that, but possibility. The possibility that Frank might reclaim himself from whiskey's grasp. The possibility of a future where her children didn't flinch at their father's footsteps. At home, The reunion was cautious but hopeful. The younger children hugged Frank exuberantly, while Thomas and Emma maintained a wary distance, having been hurt too many times to trust easily. Frank accepted their reserve with understanding, promising only that he would try to do better. That evening, as Frank prepared for his journey to Prescott, Sheriff Adams arrived to confirm the arrangements. "We'll leave at dawn," he told Frank. "The wagon will take us most of the way, but there's a day's ride at the end." Frank nodded. "I'm ready, and thank you, Sheriff. I know you didn't have to do any of this." Daniel's gaze shifted briefly to Beatrice, who was preparing dinner with Emma. "We all need help sometimes, Clarke. The measure of a man is whether he accepts it and what he does with it afterward." After dinner, as the children prepared for bed, Beatrice found herself alone on the porch with Daniel. The autumn air had a chill that promised winter wasn't far behind. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you've done for my family." Daniel leaned against the porch railing, his face thoughtful in the fading light. "No thanks needed. I'm just doing what I wish someone had done for my father." "Still, it's above and beyond your duties as sheriff." Escorting Frank to Prescott, arranging for the temperance group. "Beatrice," Daniel interrupted gently, "if I'm being honest, my motives aren't entirely selfless." She looked at him questioningly. "I've come to care for your family," he admitted. "For you, I want to see Frank succeed because it would bring you happiness, and your happiness matters to me." The simple, direct confession took Beatrice's breath away. "Daniel, you don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I know you're committed to your marriage, to giving Frank this chance. I respect that completely. I just wanted you to know that someone sees your worth, your strength. Even if things with Frank don't work out as hoped." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes at his words. How long had it been since anyone had truly seen her, had acknowledged her struggles and her determination to overcome them? "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than I can express." Daniel straightened, preparing to leave. "I'll have Frank back in 2 weeks. After that, well, it will be up to him what kind of man he chooses to be." As Beatrice watched Daniel walk away into the gathering darkness, she felt a complicated tangle of emotions: gratitude for his intervention, hope for Frank's recovery, and beneath it all, a quiet acknowledgement of what might have been under different circumstances. The following morning, Frank departed with Sheriff Adams for Prescott. He left behind his meager savings, $3.70, and a letter for each of the children, to be read while he was away. To Beatrice, he gave a simple promise: "I'll come back a better man or not at all." The 2 weeks of Frank's absence passed with surprising swiftness. Beatrice continued working, adding to their savings now that Frank wasn't drinking it away. The children thrived in the peaceful atmosphere of the home, though they spoke of their father often, wondering if he would truly return changed. On the appointed day of their return, Beatrice kept the children home from school, preparing a simple but hearty stew for dinner. When hoofbeats sounded outside in the late afternoon, all activity in the cabin ceased. Frank entered first, hat in hand, his face anxious but hopeful. Behind him came Sheriff Adams, who remained by the door, giving the family space for their reunion. "Pa!" Lucy cried, running to him. The other children followed more cautiously, watching for signs of the father they remembered versus the one they feared. Frank embraced each child in turn, his eyes suspiciously bright. When he reached Thomas, the boy hesitated before stepping into his father's arms. "I've missed you all," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to Beatrice, who had remained by the cook-stove. "Welcome home, Frank," she said softly. "Dinner's nearly ready." It was a tentative beginning, weighted with history and caution. As they ate, Frank told them about the temperance group in Prescott, men like himself, who had lost nearly everything to drink before finding their way back. "I've taken a pledge," he explained, pulling a folded certificate from his pocket. "No alcohol ever again, and I've found work too." This last revelation surprised Beatrice. "What sort of work?" Sheriff Adams introduced me to the stagecoach company in Prescott. "They need men to maintain the coaches, repair wheels and such. The pay is steady, and my leg won't be a hindrance." Frank glanced at Daniel gratefully. "I start next week, which means we'll need to move to Prescott." Beatrice absorbed this news with mixed emotions. Leaving Seligman meant leaving what little security they had established, her work at the store, Thomas's position with the blacksmith. But it also meant a fresh start, away from the saloons where Frank was known and temptation was familiar. "It's a good opportunity," Daniel added from his place at the end of the table. "Prescott is growing with better schools for the children, and the temperance group will be there to support Frank." Beatrice nodded slowly. "Then we'll go." "When?" "The company provides housing for workers," Frank explained. "A small house on the edge of town. It's not much, but it's clean and solid. Sheriff Adams says we can use his wagon to transport our belongings next week." As the meal concluded and the children helped clear the dishes, Frank took Beatrice aside. "I know I have much to prove," he said quietly, "but I want you to know I'm committed to this, to our family. The past 2 weeks have been clarifying." Beatrice searched his face, finding sincerity there that had been absent for too long. "One day at a time, Frank. That's all any of us can manage." Later, as Frank reconnected with the children, showing the twins how to repair their worn boots, listening to Sarah read from her school primer, admiring Lucy's careful stitches on a sampler, Daniel prepared to depart. "You're not staying for coffee?" Beatrice asked, following him to the porch. "Best I get back to town," he replied. "I've been away from my duties too long as it is." Beatrice studied him in the fading light. "What happens now? With you, I mean." Daniel adjusted his hat. "I'll return to the county seat after helping you folks move to Prescott. My jurisdiction covers the whole county, so I'll be through Prescott regularly. I can check on how Frank is doing with the temperance group." "And check on us?" Beatrice asked softly. His gray eyes held hers. "If that would be welcome." "It would," she admitted. "You've become important to this family, Daniel, to me." A complicated expression crossed his features, pleasure mingled with resignation. "Frank's trying, Beatrice, really trying. I saw it during our time in Prescott. Give him the chance to be the man you married." "I intend to," she assured him. "But that doesn't mean we can't be grateful for your friendship." Daniel smiled, though there was a touch of sadness in it. "Friendship, yes." As he mounted his horse, he tipped his hat one final time. "I'll see you in a week to help with the move." Beatrice watched him ride away, a curious ache in her chest. Then she turned back to her family, to Frank, who was making a genuine effort to reclaim himself, and to her children, who deserved parents who put their needs first. The week that followed was a whirlwind of preparation. They had few possessions to pack, but arrangements needed to be made. Goodbyes said to the few friends they had in Seligman. Mr. and Mrs. Holloway provided a crate of supplies as a parting gift, while the blacksmith promised Thomas a position if they ever returned. Sheriff Adams arrived as promised with a wagon for their belongings. The journey to Prescott would take 2 days, with a night camped along the trail. As they prepared to depart, Beatrice took a final walk through the cabin that had been their home for 7 years. For all its hardships, it had sheltered them through summers and winters, witnessed the birth of Lucy and the first steps of the twins. It had also seen Frank's descent into drinking and the darkest days of their marriage. "Ready?" Frank asked from the doorway, his expression gentle. "Yes," Beatrice decided. "It's time for a new beginning." The journey to Prescott passed without incident. Daniel drove the wagon while Frank rode alongside, pointing out landmarks to the children and telling stories of his youth in Pennsylvania before coming west. It was like glimpsing the man Beatrice had married, engaged, good-humored, present with his family. They arrived in Prescott as October gave way to November. The town was larger than Seligman, with proper streets, a school, and several churches. Their new home was indeed small, 3 rooms for 8 people, but it was weathertight and clean, with a proper cookstove and a well just steps from the back door. Frank's employers had stocked the pantry with basic supplies to see them through their first week. The children explored the house and yard with excitement, already planning where beds would go and which spaces would be theirs. As they unloaded the wagon, Beatrice found herself working alongside Daniel, arranging their meager furniture in the front room. "What do you think?" he asked quietly, nodding toward Frank, who was showing the boys how the stove worked. "I think he's truly trying," Beatrice replied honestly. "There's a lightness to him I haven't seen in years." Daniel nodded, satisfaction in his expression. "The man at the Temperance Society, Reverend Paulson, is a good sort, firm but understanding. He'll keep an eye on Frank." "And will you? Keep an eye on us, I mean." The question slipped out before Beatrice could reconsider it. Daniel's gaze was steady. "As long as it's helpful, yes. My duties bring me through Prescott every few weeks." Something unspoken passed between them, acknowledgement of feelings that could not be pursued but would not be denied. Then Lucy called for Beatrice, breaking the moment. "I should go," Daniel said, stepping back. "I need to reach the county line by nightfall." Beatrice walked him to his wagon, where Frank was already waiting to say goodbye. "I can never repay what you've done for my family," Frank said, extending his hand to the sheriff. "But I promise it won't be wasted." Daniel shook his hand firmly. "Just stay the course, Clarke, one day at a time." As Daniel mounted his wagon, he tipped his hat to Beatrice. "Madam, I'll see you next time I'm through Prescott." She watched him drive away with that same curious ache in her chest, then turned back to her family and their new beginning. The weeks that followed brought significant changes to the Clarke family. Frank started his job at the stagecoach company, bringing home steady wages that allowed Beatrice to focus on establishing their home rather than seeking immediate employment. The children enrolled in the local school, thriving under the structure and broader education it provided. Most significantly, Frank remained sober. He attended the temperance meetings faithfully, sometimes returning with other men for coffee and conversation around their kitchen table. He was present with his children in the evenings, helping with schoolwork or teaching them card games played for matchsticks, rather than money. With Beatrice, he was attentive and contrite, clearly working to rebuild the trust that had been broken. They shared a bed again, tentatively at first, then with growing warmth as the emotional distance between them gradually narrowed. By Christmas, the Clarke home had transformed. Simple decorations brightened the rooms, and Frank's steady income meant presents under the small pine tree they had cut from the nearby hills. Nothing extravagant, but thoughtful gifts that showed he had been paying attention to his family's needs and desires. Sheriff Adams visited twice during those first months, staying for meals and bringing small gifts for the children. He reported that the troublemakers he had been tracking originally had been sentenced in Prescott's court, closing that chapter of his duties in the area. "Will we still see you now that case is finished?" Beatrice asked during his December visit, as they washed dishes while Frank entertained the children with shadow puppets by the fire. Daniel's hands stilled on the plate he was drying. "Do you want to?" Beatrice considered the question seriously. "Yes, you've become important to this family, to me." His gray eyes studied her face, Frank is doing well, Beatrice, better than I honestly expected. He is, she agreed. He's becoming the man I married again. And yet, Daniel let the thought hang unfinished between them. Beatrice sighed softly. And yet there's a part of me that will always wonder how long it will last, if the temptation will eventually prove too strong. That's natural after what you've been through, Daniel assured her. Trust takes time to rebuild. It's not just that, Beatrice admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It's also that meeting you showed me, possibilities I hadn't considered, the kind of man you are. Daniel set down his towel, turning to face her fully. Beatrice, Sheriff, Thomas called from the front room. Pa's showing us how to make a coyote shadow. Come see. The moment broke, reality reasserting itself. They were not free to explore those possibilities. Frank was trying his hardest to be a good husband and father. The children were happier than they had been in years. And Daniel Adams was an honorable man who would never pursue another man's wife, no matter his feelings. Coming, Thomas, Daniel called back, his eyes still on Beatrice's. We should join them. Yes, she agreed, regret and resignation mingling in her heart. We should. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer. The Clarke family put down roots in Prescott, becoming part of the community. Frank received a promotion at the stagecoach company, overseeing repairs rather than simply performing them. Beatrice found work sewing for the hotel, while Emma, now 15, helped care for the local doctor's young children. Frank remained sober, one day at a time as he had promised. There were difficult moments, times when the pain in his leg flared and Beatrice could see the craving for whiskey's numbing effect in his eyes. But he persevered, leaning on the temperance group and, increasingly, on his faith. The family began attending the small Methodist church, finding community and support among its congregation. Sheriff Adams's visits became less frequent as his duties took him to other parts of the county. When he did come to Prescott, he always stopped at the Clarke home, bringing news and small gifts for the children. Beatrice noticed that he and Frank had developed a genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and Frank's gratitude for the sheriff's intervention. By the autumn of 1882, the transformation in their lives seemed complete. Frank had been sober for nearly a year. The children were thriving in school and community. They had enough money saved to buy winter boots for everyone without worry. The specter of Frank's drinking days had receded, becoming a painful memory rather than a daily threat. It was during this time of relative peace that the stagecoach route changed, bringing more traffic through Prescott and requiring the company to expand its operations. Frank was tasked with hiring and training new repairmen, a responsibility that both honored his skills and tested his leadership. Among the new hires was a man named McAllister, recently arrived from California. McAllister was skilled with woodwork and pleasant enough, but he carried a flask in his pocket and made no secret of his enjoyment of whiskey after hours. Beatrice noticed Frank's unease around the man, the way his jaw tightened when McAllister mentioned the saloon or offered a harmless nip during lunch. She saw his hand unconsciously rubbing his bad leg more frequently, a telltale sign of both physical pain and emotional struggle. You could ask for him to be moved to another team, she suggested one evening as they sat on the porch after the children were asleep. Frank sighed heavily. And admit, I can't handle working alongside a man who drinks. I've been sober a year, B. I need to prove I can resist temptation. You have nothing to prove, she countered. Especially not at the risk of your sobriety. Frank reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I appreciate your concern, truly, but I need to face this. Reverend Paulson says avoiding all contact with alcohol isn't realistic in the long term. Better to build resistance than isolation. Beatrice nodded reluctantly. Just be careful. Remember what's at stake. I remember every day, Frank assured her, gesturing toward the window where they could see the children's room. They're the reason I stay sober. You're the reason. For several weeks, Frank managed the challenge well. He came home tired but satisfied with his work, never showing signs of returning to old habits. Beatrice began to relax, believing perhaps that this test was strengthening rather than threatening his resolve. Then came the night he didn't return at dinner time. As darkness fell and Frank remained absent, Beatrice felt familiar dread creeping up her spine. She put the children to bed with reassurances that their father was likely working late, but as midnight approached with no sign of him, her fear solidified into certainty. Something was wrong. She was contemplating whether to seek help when hoofbeats sounded outside. Rushing to the door, she found not Frank but Sheriff Adams dismounting from his horse. "Daniel," she gasped, relief at seeing him mingling with renewed fear for Frank. "What are you doing here?" His expression was grim. "Frank sent for me, Beatrice. He's at the church with Reverend Paulson." "The church? Is he hurt?" Her mind raced with possibilities. "No, not hurt." Daniel removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of discomfort. He was tempted today. McAllister invited the men for drinks after they finished a big repair job. Frank went with them to the saloon. Beatrice's heart sank. "Did he drink?" "No," Daniel assured her quickly. "He said he came closer than he's been in a year, but he left before he gave in. Went straight to the Reverend instead." Relief flooded through Beatrice. "Then why didn't he come home?" "He's ashamed," Daniel said simply. "Afraid he's disappointed you by even being tempted. The Reverend asked me to come tell you he's safe and that Frank will spend the night in prayer at the church." Beatrice sank into the porch chair, emotionally exhausted. "He didn't break his pledge. He should be proud of that, not ashamed." Daniel sat beside her. "I told him the same, but he holds himself to a high standard where you and the children are concerned." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Beatrice asked, "How did the Reverend know to send for you? You weren't due in Prescott for another week." A fleeting smile crossed Daniel's face. "I may have been making more frequent visits to this area than strictly necessary for my duties." Beatrice felt warmth spread through her chest at his admission. "I'm glad you were nearby." "So am I," he said softly. Then, with visible effort, he returned to the matter at hand. "Frank asked me to tell you he'll be home in the morning, that he's sorry for worrying you." Beatrice nodded. "Thank you for bringing the message." Daniel stood, preparing to leave. "I should go. It's late and you need your rest." "Where will you stay tonight?" Beatrice asked, suddenly realizing the late hour. "I have a room at the hotel when I'm in town," he explained. An impulse seized Beatrice. "You could stay here. We have a spare pallet the boys use for guests. It's more comfortable than the hotel beds, I'm told." Daniel hesitated, clearly torn. "I don't think that would be appropriate given the circumstances." Beatrice understood his meaning immediately. With Frank absent, their staying under the same roof could spark gossip, regardless of how innocent the arrangement. "Of course, I wasn't thinking clearly." "It's been a difficult night," Daniel said kindly. "Try to get some sleep. Frank will be home in the morning and you can face this together." As he prepared to mount his horse, Beatrice called after him. "Daniel, thank you for everything you've done for our family." He turned back, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Good night, Beatrice." The next morning, Frank returned home as promised. He looked haggard from a night without sleep, but his eyes were clear and determined as he explained what had happened. "I almost failed, B," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "The smell of the whiskey, the camaraderie of the men it all reminded me of before. When drinking made everything seem easier, at least for a while." But you didn't fail, Beatrice reminded him, taking his hands in hers. You walked away. That's strength, not weakness. Frank shook his head. I shouldn't have gone to the saloon at all. It was pride wanting to prove I could resist. Instead, I nearly gave in. What matters is that you didn't, Beatrice insisted. And now you know your limits better. Frank's gaze was searching. You're not disappointed in me for being human, for fighting a difficult battle and winning even if the victory was closer than you'd like. Beatrice smiled gently. No, Frank, I'm proud of you. Relief washed over his features. I've asked to have McAllister move to another team. And I've promised Reverend Paulson I'll avoid the saloons entirely from now on. No more testing my resolve. That sounds wise, Beatrice agreed. Now come inside and see your children. They missed you last night. The incident marked a turning point in their marriage. Frank's vulnerability, his willingness to admit his struggles rather than hide them, as he once would have deepened the trust between them. Beatrice saw not weakness in his temptation but strength in his resistance, and her respect for his journey grew accordingly. As Christmas approached again, bringing with it the one-year anniversary of their move to Prescott, Beatrice found herself reflecting on how far they had come. From the desperate woman in Seligman with a drunk for a husband and hungry children, to this a stable home, a sober partner, children who laughed more than they cried. And through it all, the steady presence of Sheriff Daniel Adams, whose intervention had set them on this path and whose friendship had sustained them through the transition. Daniel arrived on Christmas Eve with gifts for the children and news. He had been offered a position as chief marshal in Prescott, which would mean a permanent move to the town. I've accepted, he told Frank and Beatrice as they sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed. I start after the new year. That's wonderful news, Frank said warmly. Prescott will be safer with you looking after it. And we'll see you more often, Beatrice added, her heart quickening at the thought. Daniel nodded, his expression carefully neutral. I'll certainly be more available to the community. As the evening wore on, Frank excused himself to retrieve a special gift he had made for Beatrice, leaving her briefly alone with Daniel. The real reason I took the position, Daniel said quietly, was to be near people I care about. To continue being part of their lives, even if only as a friend. Beatrice met his gaze, understanding all that remained unspoken between them. Friendship is a precious thing, Daniel, especially one like ours. Indeed it is, he agreed, a hint of resignation in his smile. And I'm grateful for it. Frank returned with his gift, a beautifully crafted jewelry box he had made in secret at the workshop. The moment passed, but Beatrice carried Daniel's words with her into the night, a bittersweet acknowledgment of possibilities that would remain unexplored. The years that followed brought continued stability and growth to the Clarke family. Frank remained sober, advancing at the stagecoach company until he was managing the entire repair division. Beatrice opened a small dressmaking shop that thrived among Prescott's growing population. The children matured. Emma married a young schoolteacher. Thomas apprenticed with an architect in Phoenix. And the younger ones continued their education with prospects brighter than Beatrice could have imagined during those dark days in Seligman. Daniel Adams became a fixture in their lives as Prescott's chief marshal. He dined with them regularly, attended family celebrations, and even stood as godfather to Emma's firstborn son. To the community, he was a respected lawman and family friend. To Beatrice, he remained the steady presence who had helped save her family when they needed it most. If there were moments a glance held too long, a conversation that teetered on the edge of deeper feelings, they remained just that. Moments, acknowledged silently and then carefully set aside out of respect for Frank, for vows made, for the family they had all worked to preserve. Frank, for his part, seemed aware of the complicated dynamics between his wife and the marshal. Yet rather than jealousy, he showed a curious gratitude, once confiding to Beatrice, "If anything ever happens to me, I'm glad to know Daniel would look after you and the children." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Beatrice had assured him. "You're stuck with us for the long haul," and for many years that proved true. Frank remained sober for the rest of his days, becoming a mentor to other men struggling with drink. Together, he and Beatrice watched their children grow, marry, and start families of their own. They celebrated 20 years of marriage, then 25, their love deepened by the struggles they had overcome together. When Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 62, his heart simply stopping one winter night in 1901, Beatrice mourned him deeply and sincerely. She grieved the good man he had become, the father who had found his way back to his children, the husband who had kept his promise to stay sober one day at a time for 20 years. Daniel Adams, by then in his 60s himself and retired from his position as marshal, stood beside her at the funeral, a pillar of support as he had always been. "He was a good man," Daniel said as they stood at the freshly dug grave. "One of the strongest I've ever known, to fight the battle he did and win it so completely." "He was," Beatrice agreed, tears streaming down her face. "And he knew how much he owed to you, Daniel. We both did." In the year that followed Frank's death, Daniel's visits to Beatrice's home continued, first as comfort during her mourning, then gradually evolving into something new. Their friendship, long constrained by circumstance and honor, blossomed slowly into the love that had always lingered beneath the surface. When Daniel finally asked Beatrice to marry him, on a spring evening as they sat on the porch where so many meaningful conversations had taken place over the years, she accepted with a joy tempered by the wisdom of their shared experiences. "We've waited a long time for this," she said as he slipped his mother's ring onto her finger. "Some things are worth waiting for," Daniel replied, his gray eyes now crinkled with age but still as kind as when she'd first met him holding hers. "Some people even more so." They married quietly, with their combined family surrounding them, Beatrice's 6 children, now adults with children of their own, and Daniel's nieces and nephews from his sister's family. It was not the passionate union of young lovers but the deep, abiding connection of two people who had walked separate paths alongside each other for decades before those paths finally converged. In the years they had together, Daniel and Beatrice created a new chapter that honored what had come before. They spoke often of Frank, his struggle, his triumph, his love for his family. There was no jealousy in their remembrances, only appreciation for the complex journey that had brought them all to where they were. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to Seligman that day?" Beatrice asked Daniel one evening as they sat on the porch of the home they now shared, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Daniel considered the question thoughtfully. "I believe some meetings are meant to happen one way or another, if not that day, perhaps another." "A rather romantic notion for a practical lawman," Beatrice teased. "I've learned a few things about romance in my time," Daniel replied with a smile. "Mainly that it comes in many forms, not all of them as simple as the stories would have us believe." Beatrice leaned against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. "Our story certainly wasn't simple." "No," Daniel agreed, his arm coming around her, "but it was ours, and I wouldn't change a word of it." As the sun set over Prescott, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Beatrice Clarke Adams reflected on the long journey from that desperate day in Seligman to this peaceful moment. The young woman with 6 hungry children and a husband lost to drink could never have imagined the life that awaited her, the challenges overcome. the love lost and found, the family preserved and expanded. She had learned that life rarely followed a straight path, that redemption was possible even from the darkest places, and that love could take many forms, all of them worthy, all of them part of the complex tapestry that made up a life well lived. And in the end, wasn't that the greatest gift? Not the perfect story, but the real one, messy and complicated and ultimately beautiful in its truth.